My name is Sarah Jane Smith, and I'm writing a book about your village. I'm an historian and amateur archaeologist. I'm doing a book about chalk figures on hillsides, so Wolfenden is the perfect place for me. I'm devoting a whole chapter to wolf figures, and this place is ideal. Usually it's huge chalk drawings of horses or primitive men, but a wolf carved into the hillside is almost unique in Britain. There are plenty throughout Western Europe, of course, but I was stopped by a gesture from Colin Hendrick, which was lucky because I was running out of excuses. Mr. Smith had filled me in on my chosen subject, but I knew it wouldn't be long before someone worked out that what I knew about chalk carvings could be written on the back of a postage stamp. The reason Hendrick had stopped me was because his wife had whispered something in his ear. When she stopped talking, Hendrick smiled at me. It was his usual smile, one that never reached his eyes. "Miss Smith," he said slowly, "it has been an enormous honour to have you and your son stay in our village these past couple of days, but I would appreciate you being truthful. You have entered our social event tonight less than honestly, haven't you?" I shrugged. "I really have no idea what you mean." I guessed I was probably about to be revealed not as the author of a number of local history books, which Mr. Smith had cleverly invented and sneaked onto the net, but as the journalist I really am. "I think you do, Miss Smith," he continued. "You see, I believe you came here with one purpose, to get to the bottom of our meetings, to try and expose us as eccentrics, or, worse still, as some kind of cult, trying to brainwash those that come here seeking our help." I tried smiling my most disarming smile, the sort of smile that relaxed even the Jadoon. "Oh, you've got me wrong, Mr. Hendrick. I'm just here, trying to write my book and soak up some—" Again he cut across me, but this time there was an edge to his voice. "But you are wrong, Miss Smith. You see, our village meeting tonight, with all these people, is offering genuine help. They have at some point in their lives, contrary to what the press, the government, and even the church would have you believe, been abducted by aliens. And, as fellow abductees ourselves, my family is committed to providing them with a safe haven here in Wolfenden. If you are going to write a book about us, it would have been so much simpler if you'd said so right from the start." My relief that he merely thought I wanted to investigate his strange little village passed quickly. After all, I knew better than most that it was entirely possible that each of these people had, at some point, been stolen away from their lives and prodded or poked by some passing Arcatinian poet or Pacar academic or Sycorax slaver. These things happened. Just when I thought he'd provided me with a respite from his questions, the door to the big house crashed open. A teenage girl, about 15 years old, stood there, looking around wildly, trying to get her bearings. She was sweating and panting, as if she'd run all the way from the trunk road 2 miles outside the village. Is this the place?" she asked unhelpfully. I was about to ask her what she meant, but Hendrick was up and out of his seat first, slowly but carefully helping the girl to a seat with a clearly experienced manner. Another of the abductees was over to the tea urn instantly, preparing some hot, sweet tea. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Hendrick asked her, not unkindly. The teenager seemed to be getting her breath back, and eventually took a final, deep, rasping gulp of air as she looked around. "I'm in the right place, yeah? You see, 3 years ago, I was abducted by aliens, but now I've escaped, and I need your help. Your help!" Colin Hendrick pursed his lips. Perhaps escape was a new take on alien abduction he'd not encountered before. "Okay, young lady, relax," he said calmly. "Tell me your name." The newcomer looked up, her eyes almost feverish with fear, excitement. I really couldn't tell. She looked straight at me, just for a second, then back to the group. "Chandra," she said loudly. "My name is Rani Chandra." The Sarah Jane Adventures, The White Wolf, by Gary Russell. Read by Elisabeth Sladen. You're kidding, right? Was Clyde's contribution to the discussion. You two swan off to the country, leaving us here to sweat over some stupid test, knowing you're facing memory-sucking aliens and giant wolves. Actually, Luke said, the wolf isn't a real giant one. It's just an image carved into the chalky hillside. We don't know that there are aliens or that anyone's memories have been sucked. I sighed. This never got any easier. What had brought on Clyde's tantrum was a letter I had received that morning. Dear Miss Smith, you won't remember me. My name is Edison Clough. I live in a village called Wolfenden in Dorset. I was a friend to your Aunt Lavinia, or at least I believed I was. To explain, I saw your piece in Metropolitan magazine written about 5 years ago, after your aunt's passing. I realised that I have some photographs of your aunt, and indeed yourself as a girl, upon my wall. They were taken next to the old rectory. I am in the photographs too. I do hope you will not be offended if I tell you that your aunt and I appear to be close companions in these photographs. Sadly, I have no memory of this. Indeed, I am only surmising these facts simply because I have these photographs. I have many photographs taken during my life, and in most of them, I appeared to be very happy indeed. I keep them close by in case they trigger a memory. You see, I moved back to Wolfenden a few months ago, after I identified it from the photos. I know nothing about the place or the people who live here. I don't recognize any of it, nor does anyone here remember me or my family, if I had one. Over the past few months, I have tracked down some of the people in these photos, only to find that none of them remembers me or Wolfenden. Indeed, despite the photographic evidence, none of them believes they have ever visited the place. I fully expect that this is true of you, too. I would dearly love to be wrong, to be able to find someone who remembers this place, other than those who live here now. I gather from reading up on you that you are a good writer. I believe investigative journalism is what they call it. This place needs investigating, Miss Smith. Why does nobody remember being here? A large number of people who live in the village now claim to have been abducted by aliens. Could this account for the memory gaps I have? Could I have been abducted? Have you ever been abducted? What other reason can there be for why no one in the photos knows me? Why don't I know either you or your late aunt, despite the evidence on my wall? Help me understand, Miss Smith, please. I am an old man and do not wish to go to my grave without answers. When I'd read the letter, I asked Mr. Smith to research Edison Clough. After all, he seemed to think he knew me and my Aunt Lavinia, even though he was quite right that I had no memory of him or this Wolfenden place. Of Edison Clough, I can find no trace, Sarah Jane, after 1972, Mr. Smith reported. He seems to have disappeared, although I have found this. A picture appeared on Mr. Smith's screen, an old one from the 1960s, going by the surrounding newsprint and style of the layout. Lavinia, I breathed. There was my aunt, just as I remembered her from growing up in the big house in Suffolk. And beside her, according to the headline, was Dr. Edison Clough, M.D., FASCP, a clinical pathologist from Rochdale. They had, it transpired, worked together on some kind of new... And my eyes glazed over. One thing about Lavinia's work, even as a kid, I never really understood it. I think it's why I specialised in English and humanities. Maths and science were Aunt Lavinia's domain, but the bottom line, as Mr. Smith had explained, was that Clough had been a very important scientist back in those days, just like my aunt. OK, so that was mystery number one. Then there was Wolfenden. Mr. Smith explained it was a small village in West Dorset. Like 100 other English villages, he told me, it has a small tourist industry because of the white wolf. Of course, a number of areas in west and southwest England are famous for ancient chalk images carved into their hillsides. Carvings like the white horses of places like Uffington and Sherrill. Mr. Smith agreed. Those and the giant humans in Wilmington and Cerne Abbas. Wolfenden is named after a wolf chalked on its hillside, under which are a series of caves and tunnels. Mr. Smith paused, gathering more data. Interestingly, some years ago, Wolfenden became a refuge for people who believed they had been abducted by aliens. Ah, and I thought weird professors and chalk animals was going to be enough for one day. And have they? I mused. I cannot answer that with any degree of accuracy. I apologise, Mr. Smith said. I saw no need to drag Clyde or Rani into this, not least because I couldn't see their parents letting either of them out, this close to exams. So I asked Mr. Smith to book Luke and me into a self-catering cottage in Wolfenden. But you will take Luke? I laughed. Oh, yes, I can just imagine how much revision will get done if I leave him here without supervision. Luke might be smart, but he'll still be taking his revision with him. I would enjoy being privy to that conversation, Mr. Smith said. So that was how I came to be having this conversation with Clyde and Rani. Seriously, Sarah Jane, said Clyde. You need us. We're your backup, the team. But I shook my head and looped my arm round Luke's. Come on, you, get a bag packed. We're off. A few hours and a couple of 100 miles later, we were settling into our picture postcard cottage on the outskirts of Wolfenden. I put the kettle on and Luke found the remote for the TV. Only a few channels, no satellite or digital out here. But we were interrupted by a knock at the door. I crossed the kitchen and opened the heavy wooden door that promised to keep the weather outside, whatever the time of year. Standing there was a boy of about 10, with pale skin and white hair, but the most dark eyes, almost black. He was carrying a thermos and a small basket of fresh fruit. He held them out to me. My dad sent these over. I'm sorry, but you are? I said. Ben Hendrick, he said. My dad lives in the manor. Years of experience kicked in. I felt my heart beat just a little bit faster. What had he been about to say before going for, my dad lives in the manor? My dad knows who you really are. My dad has cameras hidden in the cottage. My dad rules the village with a rod of iron. My dad has a creepier voice than I do. I shrugged and just smiled. Well, that's very kind of him. My name is Sarah Jane. I know, Ben said. You write books. You do your homework, I laughed. I looked you up on the net. Yes, my son and I are here to research the white wolf. I lied so easily. Ben said nothing, and I realised he was looking past me into the cottage. I followed his gaze to where Luke was standing. Ben cocked his head slightly, as if sizing Luke up, but I couldn't put my finger on why. This is my son. Luke, this is Ben. Look, his father sent us some tea and fruit. Luke has a way of looking at things sometimes that reminds me of his heritage, reminds me that he was created by an alien race called the Bane as an example of the perfect human child. It gave him a mannered approach to things that was uniquely his. Nothing was said for a few seconds, as if the two boys were trying to outstare each other. Was this some kind of contest? It was broken by Luke, who suddenly smiled and walked forward, stretching his hand out. Hi, thanks for that, Ben. I realised he had positioned himself in the doorway between me and Ben. The younger boy actually had to lean his body to one side to see round Luke and address me. Dad says he looks forward to saying hello tomorrow. Luke moved again, just slightly, but enough to block my view of Ben, or Ben's view of me. I wasn't sure which. Ben must have moved off, because Luke suddenly said, "Bye then," and shut the door. He turned and headed back towards his room. "Whoa, hold on, mister," I said. "What just happened?" He shrugged. "Nothing. I just didn't like the way he looked at you." "So, what, you were gallantly standing between us to protect me?" Luke shrugged. "Yeah, Of course I was. As Luke wandered off, I stood there, unsure what to think. I mean, it was marvellous that my son instinctively protected me, but I just didn't see what the threat had been. Luke wasn't given to fanciful notions, though, so something about the younger boy had really spooked him. And if Luke Smith was spooked by something, enough to want to protect me, then I knew something was wrong with Ben Hendrick, and that meant I had to find out what. I got up early the following morning and walked round the village, getting to know the place under the guise of writing this book about the chalk wolf on the hillside. I had the letter from Edison Clough in my jacket pocket, and I decided to seek him out. It wasn't difficult. A couple of villagers pointed his home out to me. I knocked on the door, and an old man answered, haunted eyes sunken into his sallow skin. "Oh, at last you've come," he said. "Mr. Clough?" I asked. "Recognised you from the pictures," he said. "Thank you for coming, Miss Smith." He stood aside, not shaking my hand or anything, so I stepped inside. His home needed a good sort-out. Mind you, it needed cleaning even more. I was a bit nervous about touching some of the surfaces, in case some alien life form was lying in wait, disguised as dust. I followed him through the kitchen area into a small back room. Then I stopped and stared. Every last bit of wall space was covered with photos and newspaper cuttings, all pinned up, all overlapping. The wall beneath could have been white stone, brick, or painted purple with yellow spots, for all I could tell. "My life," he said, "as much as I can piece together." I thought back to his letter, the stuff about not remembering me or my Aunt Lavinia. "How much of your life can you recall?" I asked. "Since moving back here, everything, and obviously some immediate time before, but there's a huge blank. I have nothing from the age of about 39 through to my early 70s, nothing. These newspapers tell me I achieved a lot and that I lived here in Wolfenden for a while, but I don't know for sure. How can I? These photos show me with friends, colleagues, whatever." He suddenly turned to me, his eyes watering. "Do you realise, Miss Smith, that one of these pictures could be me with my wife, my children? I wouldn't know because after 1972, I know nothing until 2004. I found myself drawn here last year. Things started to fall into place, but at the same time, everything fell apart because that's when I realised it was this place that had stolen my memories." I reached up to a picture of me. I must have been about 8 years old. And that was Lavinia. I'd know that smile anywhere. But the picture meant nothing to me emotionally. I didn't recall it being taken, didn't recognise the location or the clothes that we were wearing or anything. It was as if someone had glued our faces into someone else's picture. But I knew that wasn't the case. I looked at Aunt Lavinia's face, tracing her cheekbones with my finger. "She was amazing," I said finally. Clough nodded. "Good. I like to think I had good taste in friends." He tapped at the same photo. "That's me, I believe. I look the same in that photo as others I've positively identified as me from around that age." He looked back at me. "Who stole our memories, Miss Smith?" I couldn't give him an answer, but I was going to find out. My meeting with Mr. Hendrick went pretty much as I expected a meeting with a head man of the village to be. Colin Hendrick was charming, courteous, and calm. He happily answered my questions about the White Wolf as much as he could. He and his family had only been in Wolfenden a handful of years, but they had certainly brushed up on their local knowledge. Tourism had dropped off, he told me. The National Trust had wanted to build a visitors' centre, but the villagers had voted against it. It was their White Wolf, after all. So they'd ended up with more shops instead, but no tourists turning up to spend any money. I thanked him for sending Ben over the previous night and returned the thermos. "He was impressed by the number of books you've written, Miss Smith," he continued. "Quite the established author." "Thank you," I smiled. "So, tell me about the village itself." Hendrik didn't even flinch. "Best thing you can do, Miss Smith," he said, smooth as silk, "is talk to everyone. We're having a village meeting in the parish hall tonight. Why not pop in at the start and meet everyone then? I will have to be rude and ask you not to stay for the main event. It's all our private village stuff, but we always start with a bit of a coffee session. My wife organises it, and I'm sure you'll meet lots of interesting people there. Actually, I bumped into one person this morning," I continued. "Mr. Clough." Hendrik frowned. "Poor old Edison," he said quietly. "Been here a few years, before we moved in. He's not really all there. We all look after him as best we can, but it might be best if you took some of his more fantastical ramblings for what they are, eccentricities. He sees shadows sometimes where there aren't any, and conspiracies behind every door. Nice old man, but not someone I recommend you spend too much time with." Was he challenging me? His tone was charming, but there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on that felt wrong. Further questioning was interrupted by my mobile ringing. "Do excuse me, Mr. Hendrik," I said, turning away to answer and glancing at the screen. It read, "Luke." He was wondering when I was heading back and what we were doing about food. I told him to make himself some toast and explained I was busy. As I ended the call, I realised Colin Hendrik had already wandered away. I had, it seemed, been dismissed. I was back at the cottage 10 minutes later, calling for Luke as I went through the door. He was out in the back garden, lying on his back, reading one of the school books piled around him. Oh, it would have been so much easier if he'd been sleeping or just lazing about, but he was actually doing what he was supposed to be doing, and I was going to spoil it. Although the big bag, the very big bag of sweets cost him a few brownie points, mainly because of the number of empty wrappers beside it. "Or you, I said toast. You'll spoil your dinner with those, not to mention your teeth." "Hey, Mum," he said, not looking up from his book, but tapping the sweets with a pen. "Bane teeth, never decay." True, he'd never needed a dentist. "Won't stop you getting fat," I threw in, not actually knowing if that was true. He shoved the empty wrappers back into the bag and then scrunched it into his denim jacket pocket. "Okay, bad parenting moment coming up," I announced. "Stop whatever homework you're doing. I need you to help me." Luke closed the book and smiled. "What do you want me to do?" "Wander round, talk to people. Be nosy. Find out as much as you can about the Hendrik family." I told him about my conversations with Edison Clough and Colin Hendrik. "Oh," I finished, "and see if you can find that strange son of his and talk to him." "I didn't like him," Luke muttered. "He seemed—" "What?" I prompted. "I don't know," Luke shrugged. "He just seemed wrong. As if he didn't— Oh, it sounds stupid, Mum." "No, go on. What?" "It was as if he didn't fit into the world. As if he wasn't meant to be here, and he knew it. I don't think he's human." I thought about that. The Hendriks were certainly strange, but I hadn't considered they might not be human. I told Luke to go with his instincts and see what he could find out. "Be careful," I said, and reached to kiss him on the cheek, but he sidestepped and just patted my arm with an indignant "Mum," and was gone. Luke, like Rani and Clyde, was growing up, and kisses from his mum were no longer required, it seemed. One minute they're all hugs and kisses and comfort, and then overnight it's, "Don't touch me and I can look after myself." The rest of my afternoon was relatively uneventful. I couldn't find Edison Clough, so I just walked around, had lunch at a nice tea shop, and generally soaked up the ambience, listening to as much casual conversation as I could. But nothing I overheard provided any further ammunition for Clough's claims. Luke, as he told me later, had quite a different experience. He had immediately gone wandering towards the Hendricks' big manor house at the heart of the village, assuming that if he walked into the gardens, either someone would stop him or he'd get as far as ringing the doorbell and see what happened. As it turned out, he'd barely got to the gate when a voice spoke to him, saying hello, and he found himself facing Mrs. Hendrick. Like Ben, she had almost alabaster skin tones, pure white hair and dark eyes. Unlike Ben, she was almost immobile, sat on a bench under a willow tree as if hiding from the sunlight. She actually asked Luke at one point to move slightly so that he was blocking her view of the bright blue sky. "You must be Miss Smith's boy," she said in a very quiet voice. "Luke, isn't it?" He nodded and explained he was looking for Ben. "He's up in the hills," Mrs. Hendrick said. "You should find him by the wolf. I'm sure he'll be happy to find someone his own age." So Luke started the steep climb in the direction of the white wolf on the hillside. These chalk figures may have been carved into the sides of hills and mountains at any time from the Bronze Age to the 17th century. Their origins are lost in the mists of time, but have fascinated people ever since. The wolf could be seen clearly from the village, but as Luke got further and further up, it became less and less visible. After half an hour, he had lost his bearings, and he was about to give up and head back to the village when there was a noise. He didn't hear it as such, but he felt it. A dull bass thump running through his feet, as if something was moving deep within the hill. Clyde later suggested to Luke that maybe it felt like there was a rave going on inside the hill, music vibrating through the ground, which Luke agreed was a good description. As he bent down to place his palm on the ground, he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. No one had followed him up, he was sure of that. And surely he'd have seen if Ben Hendrick or anyone else had been on the hillside. There were no trees or anything to get masked by, just acres of grass. Ignoring the rhythmic pulsing in the ground, Luke scrambled further up, towards where he glimpsed the movement that might or might not have been Ben. And then the world gave way, and he was falling. While Luke was having his adventure, I was having a hard time with Edison Clough. He was anxious to know if I had found any answers, but when I pointed out that, apart from him, there was nothing to suggest anything was wrong in Wolfenden, he got cross. Although my every instinct told me there was something strange going on, I had to tell Clough that the evidence was circumstantial at best. "Even if I did think there was something bad happening here," I explained to him, "I'm not sure what I could do about it." "But our memories," he cried. "Yours, mine, heaven knows who else's. And these alien abduction theories." I stopped him. "Mr. Clough," I said, "there are countless people who believe they've been abducted all over the world. It's not exactly a stretch to suppose that if someone sets up a support group somewhere as remote as this village, those people will travel great distances to come here and find solace, help, support, whatever. I'm sorry. I don't know why neither of us remember being here, but I don't think it's anything to do with alien abduction." I looked at his confused, desperate face and felt guilty. He really seemed to have put so much faith in the idea that I might be able to help him and answer his questions. But I just didn't have the answers he needed. And not yet, anyway. "Look," I said, "Colin Hendrick's having some sort of village meeting tonight, and he's asked me to go. Come with me." Clough shook his head. "It'll be about alien abductees," he said. "It always is. I went once and realised that was what it was about. I want nothing to do with them." "Why do they scare you?" I asked. Clough opened his mouth to answer, and stopped. I gave him an encouraging look, and he took a deep breath and explained that this was his greatest fear. "What if I was abducted? What if that's the reason I don't have these memories? I don't want to know. I'm scared. Nearly 40 years of my life is missing. I don't want to think I spent all that time with aliens, telling them secrets about Earth or whatever." I felt so sorry for him. I knew from my own experiences that someone like Edison Clough was likely to be far too insignificant to any aliens to be worth keeping for 40 years. But I couldn't say that to him. Instead, I took his hands in mine and told him to sit tight and that I'd be back tomorrow with news of whatever I could find out. I made to leave, glancing back at the photo of me and Aunt Lavinia in Wolfenden. And I wondered if I'd ever get any answers to satisfy me, let alone him. Luke, however, was getting surprise after surprise. First, there'd been that vibration. Then the ground had given way. But the next thing he knew, his wrist was gripped and he found himself suspended in midair. Whoever had stopped him falling was holding on tightly amid much grunting. "Someone could do with going on a diet," said a familiar voice. Scrabbling a little himself whilst being pulled up, Luke was brought face to face with his rescuer. Clyde winked at Luke. "Gotta say, Lukey boy, you can't be trusted to go anywhere without me watching your back." Luke could only ask the obvious. "Clyde, what are you doing here?" He got the equally obvious reply, saving you as always. It turned out that Clyde had made straight for the hill as soon as he'd arrived in Wolfenden. Coming up the hill from a different direction, he'd seen Luke walking towards the eye of the chalk wolf. This meant Clyde could see that the eye was actually a hole in the ground, something Luke wouldn't have known until he was right on top of it. It wasn't really a huge drop down so much as a slight drop into the mouth of a cave. Being boys, neither of them could quite resist the temptation to go in. Although they couldn't call to let me know, of course, not without my finding out that Clyde had disobeyed my instructions to stay in London. So it was that the two boys were now traipsing through an underground cave, accessed via the White Wolf's eye, trying to find the source of the rhythmic vibrations they both felt, not just beneath their feet now, but all around them. They soon realised that the tunnels were curiously light, enough not to require torches, suggesting to them that something was indeed down there. "Hope we don't get lost down here, Lukey," Clyde said, staring at his mobile phone. "0 bars, no reception?" "Not a problem," said Luke. He held up the bag of sweets he'd had earlier and pointed behind them. A trail of empty wrappers lay on the floor. "Litterbug," Clyde said, but Luke shook his head. "Remember that story Mrs. Pitman told us in history about the Minotaur and Perseus in the labyrinth?" Clyde shrugged. "Is that the one where Perseus chokes the Minotaur to death on sweet wrappers, huh?" Knowing they could retrace their steps, they moved on, and eventually they found what they were looking for. Not that they'd known what they were looking for, but now they'd found it, they knew what it was. It was a cavern, and inside, lit by small globes of yellow, almost sulphurous light, was a group of people. They all looked like Ben Hendrick, white hair, sallow skin, black eyes. They were milling around some tall tubes that had been planted into the ground to keep them upright. To one side was a metallic box with controls of some sort on it, its base also buried slightly. "Okay," Clyde said. "That's weird." "No," Luke told him. "That's brilliant. They've taken their alien technology and adapted it to our planet, grown it into the ground to keep it going." "How do you know that, then?" asked Clyde. "Just seems obvious," Luke said. "All right, Spock," said Clyde. "What are they doing? Mining, testing, planning a fireworks display?" Luke shrugged. "How do I know?" "Oh, I thought you knew everything," Clyde muttered. "No," Luke said, "but let's get closer and maybe I will." They stopped because they were suddenly surrounded by the group of white-faced people, including Ben Hendrick. "Knew I saw you outside," Luke said. "You should not have come here," Ben said. Clyde pointed at the tubular devices. "What are they?" He walked over to get a closer look before recoiling slightly. There's people inside! What's going on?" Luke, of course, was already examining the technology. His perfectly engineered brain storing, assimilating and theorizing simultaneously. "It's a hibernation system," he said after a beat. "These people are aliens, Clyde. They're awaiting revivification." Clyde frowned at him. "In English?" Luke sighed. "These people are asleep, waiting to be woken up." Clyde shrugged. "Oh, thought that's what you meant. Just checking." Ben came over and eased Luke away from the control panels. "Please don't touch. The tech is way beyond anything you humans could possibly understand." Suggesting he is ignorant can be a red rag to a bull where Luke is concerned. Had I been there, I would have stopped him, but Clyde wasn't fast enough. "Nonsense," Luke said. "It's advanced, but still quite basic. Your systems are all organic-based. You've grown this machinery straight out of the chalk landscape here in the caves under the White Wolf." He smiled at Clyde. "I was wrong earlier about them adapting existing tech. This is grown specifically to cope with the environment here." He turned back to Ben. "Your people are in a chemically induced stupor. You just need the correct chemical cocktail to revive them." Clyde grabbed Luke's arm. "Best not tell them you understand all this. They might think you're a threat." "Or that I could help them," Luke replied. Clyde sighed. "Yeah, but do you want to help them? For all you know, this is an invasion force." "Are you an invasion force?" Luke asked Ben. And I could only imagine the expression that must have been on Clyde's face now. Instead of answering, Ben got a phone-like device out of his pocket and spoke into it. "Commander," he began. "Ah, he can get a signal," Clyde muttered. "Great." While this was going on, I continued investigating the village, trying to find justification for Edison Clough's paranoid claims. I wasn't getting anywhere, to be frank. Before long, however, it was time for the village meeting Colin Hendrick had invited me to, so I made my way to the manor house. There were lots of people in the meeting room where the social was to be held, far more than I'd been expecting. They were all sipping tea from dainty china cups and saucers, and eating neatly cut sandwiches and fruit salads. It was all so perfect and unnatural, not least because, as Edison Clough had said, there was no one here over 40 years old, and there were no children. There was something in the air, not tension as such, but an underlying sense of anticipation, excitement. I couldn't place it, but every instinct, every part of me insisted that there was something wrong. Over the next few minutes, I was introduced to an endless array of people whose names I would never remember, including a man who brought me a fresh cup of tea. "My sister tells me you're writing a book about our marvellous chalk wolf," he said. "I'm Roland Hendrick." I could see the family resemblance to Mrs. Hendrick, at least. Pale skin, white hair, dark eyes. "I run the local amateur dramatic society," Roland continued. "We were thinking of putting on a play about the history of the village and its origins of the wolf. When do you think it was created, Miss Smith?" "Wolves are usually older than horses," I said, recalling Mr. Smith's notes. "Most likely Bronze Age." Roland nodded. "I thought so too, although the cave system is more recent." That threw me. "Really?" Mr. Smith hadn't given me any hints about that. "I assumed they were prehistoric," I countered, thinking on my feet. "Oh, no, not at all," Roland smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Indeed, I could have caught a cold from the look in his eyes. Was this man dangerous? I don't know how or what reason I had to wonder that, but I just knew it. I stepped back straight into Mr. and Mrs. Hendrick. Another person was with them. "Miss Smith," said Mrs. Hendrick, "meet Angela Colby, our newest resident." The young lady I was meeting held her hand out and I shook it, babbling slightly. "Hello, my name is Sarah Jane Smith. I'm writing a book about your village. I'm an historian and amateur archaeologist. I'm doing a book about chalk figures on hillsides, so Wolfenden is the perfect place for me. I'm devoting a whole chapter to wolf figures, and this place is ideal. Usually it's huge chalk drawings of horses or primitive men, but a wolf carved into the hillside is almost unique in Britain. There are plenty throughout Western Europe, of course, but..." That was the point that Colin Hendrick cut me off, accused me of trying to do an exposé on these people's alien experiences. And then the door had been flung open by someone claiming she'd been kidnapped by aliens. Someone who just happened to be my young friend, Rani Chandra. My evening was weird enough, but Clyde and Luke's was even stranger. The group of albino-like aliens in the caves had formed a protective cordon around their comatose fellows in the tubes. And then, having finished communicating with whoever he'd been talking to, Ben Hendrik ordered the boys to be taken captive. Unsurprisingly, Luke and Clyde bolted, running into the cave system. "Where are your sweet wrappers?" Clyde yelled as they scarpered. "Not here," Luke stated. "I can see that," said Clyde. "Keep alien caves tidy campaign, do you think?" "No," Luke said, dragging Clyde into a side tunnel. "Wrong set of tunnels. We came in from the left. We went into a right-hand tunnel from that main area," he said, as if that explained everything. Which actually it did, but that wasn't entirely enough for poor Clyde. "Then why do we run into these ones?" "I just followed you," Luke replied. They stopped for a breather, Clyde sighing. "Yeah, great. You just followed me. Clyde this way. Might have helped, you know, Luke." Luke shrugged. "These tunnels were closer and we could have got separated. Then I would have had to rescue you." "You? Rescue me? Hey, I do all the rescuing around here, remember?" Clyde smiled, mimicking his grabbing of Luke's arm earlier when he'd fallen into the cave system. "Course," Luke grinned. "I'll remember that next time." "If there is a next time," said Clyde. "Let's keep going." He moved further into the darkness, and if Luke hadn't grabbed the back of his T-shirt, he might have dropped off a ledge. "Yeah, you do the rescuing," Luke muttered, scooping up a couple of pebbles and dropping them over the ledge. Silence. Then plop, plop, as they hit water. "About 25.5 meters, Luke said. "If you'd gone over and hit the water, it wouldn't have been pretty," he said. Clyde took a deep breath. "Okay, you are now officially King Rescuer of the Rescue People. So, Your Majesty, which way now?" "Back the way you came would be the best option," said Ben Hendrik from behind them. "Certainly the safest." Clyde shrugged. "You say that? I'm not convinced." As the boys were led back to the main cave chamber, Luke asked one of the aliens why they were in the caves and was told they were simply trying to go home. "Every 50 years, the alien explained, "a ship from our home planet comes into range. They've been trying to find us for hundreds of your years, but we have no communications equipment powerful enough to contact them. So we need to stay comatose until we can reactivate the devices that will let them know which planet in this solar system we're stranded upon." "And they can't track you down?" Clyde asked. Another alien shook his head. "Our ship crashed into these hills and went through the ground, collapsing on top of us. What little was left of the ship is buried too deeply for them to trace. But we are down here now because it is time to try again." By now they were back at the tubular capsules, and Luke pulled away from Ben and the others to inspect it. After a moment he grinned at them. "This organic technology is fantastic. These people are being kept alive by a strange mixture of chemicals." One of the aliens was about to yank him back, but was stopped by the one he'd talked to in the caves. "You understand it?" "No, not entirely," said Luke. "I mean, I can see the principle, but I don't know what chemicals you use." The alien breathed hard on his surface, and a screen seemed to shimmer into existence, as if it had just been grown there. Displayed on it were numbers and letters. Clyde knew these were chemical formulae. Mr. Cunningham's lessons were paying off. Hooray! But not what they represented. Well, maybe not hooray then, but certainly an interesting Luke was looking at the formulae, then back at the aliens. "These aren't chemicals naturally found in your bodies, are they? Otherwise you'd have loads of supplies of them. These are only found in humans." "Body-stealing chemists," Clyde muttered. "Whatever next?" "Not body-stealing, Clyde," corrected Luke. "This is brilliant. They're harvesting chemicals from the humans in the village." He grinned at the aliens in that way he does whenever he's got it. "That's why the village only has young people in it. That's why they're all newcomers. Because you've used up the originals. People like Edison Clough, they moved away because they were traumatised by what had happened to their memories. You ran out of chemicals needed to power up your equipment, keep these people alive but asleep, and rebuild your communication system. It's organic technology. It's like a huge brain, and that's where you get your chemicals from. Human brains. Clyde was seriously freaked out by this. They eat brains? Luke shook his head. No, don't you see? It's the chemicals in the human brain that control short-term and long-term memory. That's why Edison Clough can't remember much. Why Mum can't remember being here. She and her Aunt Lavinia must have been here during a harvesting period. So, these chemicals that help us remember things, that's petrol to these guys? Luke nodded. Of course, the alien abduction thing. It's real. Well, sort of real. I mean, those people all believe they were abducted. But even if they weren't, their memories are now jumbled up, because when they visited Wolfenden to join the abductee group, the Hendricks drew out the chemicals that control their memories, confusing them and helping sustain this technology. It's brilliant, Clyde. No, Lukey, Clyde said quietly. It's wrong. Luke looked surprised at him. Well, of course it's wrong, and Mum will find a way to stop them. But that doesn't mean it's not a brilliant kind of technology in principle. Ben stepped forward. Your mother won't stop us, he said. I have told my father that you are here, and he'll be dealing with Sarah Jane Smith right now. Luke backed away, but it was too late. The aliens grabbed him and Clyde. And the good thing is that everyone has memories, said Ben, including you two. Not many, of course, but every little helps. Our ship will be in orbit tonight, and your memories, endorphins and chemicals will be added to our power cells to help boost the signal and draw them to us so they can take us home. They dragged Luke to a stone seat that simply grew out of the floor as they approached. Clyde tried to struggle to get to Luke, but the aliens were stronger and they held him tight. Luke was forced to sit on the seat. A strange headset grew out of the stone chair, wrapped itself around his temples and started to vibrate. As it began to access his memories, Luke cried out. You're killing him! Yelled Clyde. Ben smiled. No, we are just utilizing his memory engrams to replenish our fuel supplies. At the stone chair, one of the other aliens suddenly frowned and called a couple of others over. Ben joined them. What is it? He demanded. My parents need a full report. Clyde could only watch in horror as they stared at their readouts and then back at Luke, squirming in the chair, the headset still on his head. Ben looked across at Clyde. Are you the same as him? Yeah, no, maybe. Clyde wasn't sure of the best answer to give. Why? Ben laughed. No, you're not, are you? You're just a normal human. The machinery suddenly stopped vibrating, and Luke slumped slightly. What have you done to him? Clyde shouted. I'm okay, Luke called out. Just a bit tired. Ben unstrapped him and helped him up as the stone chair withdrew back into the ground. That is impossible, the alien boy said to Luke. You are impossible. Luke took a deep breath, then grinned. No, not impossible, but Clyde would tell you I am brilliant. Yeah, Clyde said. Yeah, he is. He shook himself free of his captors. Mind you, he can be a bit of a big head too, if you ask me. Luke looked around the assembled aliens. I know the truth. He pointed at the readings that Ben and the other couple of aliens had been looking at. It's all there for you to read. You see? You tried taking my memories, but I accessed yours instead. He turned to Ben. I think we need to talk to your mum and dad, he said. And here's why. Roland Hendrick was giving Rani a cup of tea, telling her how fortunate it was that she had arrived tonight, just as they were holding a social, and explaining that most of the other people in the room were fellow abductees. I was furious that Rani had disobeyed me. What were Geeta and Haresh going to say? but I had to admit that it had been a very clever move to pretend to be an alien abductee. It had automatically made her the centre of attention, and someone the Hendrick family wouldn't doubt. They were slowly introducing her to the other people in the village who had suffered similarly. "Who's she?" Rani asked suddenly, pointing at me. "That is Sarah Jane Smith. She's a writer, and says she's doing a book about this village. But we think she's here to ridicule people like you. People who have had terrible extraterrestrial experiences." Colin Hendrick looked at me. She was just leaving and going back to London in the morning. There was a knock at the door. Roland opened it, and I saw a hand pass a note through. I caught a glimpse of an alabaster-toned arm, then it was gone. Another member of the Hendrick family? Or... Then I realised I should have trusted my instincts. The Hendricks weren't human at all, probably not even a real family. They were aliens themselves. I tried to think of a species that had pure white skin and those dark eyes. They were most likely subterranean in origin, or had spent their lives in spaceships or space stations, somewhere out of direct sunlight. But I couldn't place the species specifically. What was Colin Hendrick, though? He didn't seem to share their common look. I thought it would be a good idea to get out now, but I needed to find a way to get Rani out too. It was brave of her to try and help, although I couldn't see what she thought she could achieve. "My dad hates journalists," Rani said loudly. "He says they should crawl back into the caves they came from." Clever girl. She knew that would get my interest, and there was a message in there. Mr. Smith must have worked something out after Luke and I had left Ealing. Something about caves. Of course, the caves beneath the White Wolf. "My brother reckons if we put all the newspaper and TV people into caves and sealed them in, it'd cut off their power. Clyde says the media is wrong." So, the caves was where the aliens' power was based. Good girl, Rani. And Clyde, obviously not her brother, but the villagers didn't know that. So she was saying what? That he was at the caves. Colin Hendrick straightened up as he read the note given to him by Roland. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should call it a night. I'm so sorry, but I've just had some bad news. My wife and I need to be alone." A buzz went through the crowd. This dismissal was clearly unusual, but nobody argued. Roland began ushering the guests out of the room, and Rani stood up. Colin Hendrick eased her back into her seat, and I realised that Mrs. Hendrick was now standing between me and the door, a look on her face that suggested a challenge. As Roland exited, closing the doors behind him, I knew the game was up. "You played your hand too well, Rani," said Colin Hendrick. "All that cave stuff. You should have left that for later, and I might have missed it. I take it you and Miss Smith know each other?" Rani glanced at me, and I smiled and nodded. "I'm sorry, Sarah Jane," she said. "Oh, you're brilliant, Rani," I said, proud of her for trying. Then I turned to the Hendricks. "What planet are you from?" Hendrick shrugged. "I'm from Manchester, actually," he said. "I, however," said his wife, "am from the Tristian cluster." "That's a series of asteroids," Rani said. "Your homeworld broke up years ago, and your species has lived in the pieces ever since. The asteroids were caught in orbit around your moon. They're further away from your sun than they used to be, but they still get enough solar energy to keep them warm." She looked at me. "Mr. Smith was very thorough once he tracked the ship across our solar system." "Your husband?" asked an incredulous Colin Hendrick. "My computer," I said proudly. "Along with Rani and Luke and Clyde, we put a stop to people like you." "People who just want to survive?" asked Mrs. Hendrick. "People who just want to go home. How very uncivilized." "No," I said, "no. If that was all you wanted, I'd be the first in the queue to help you. But you are doing something to the people in this village, and the poor souls who come to you for help, believing they've been abducted by aliens." Mrs. Hendrick told Rani and me about the memory chemicals. "And you go along with this assault on people's brains?" I asked Colin Hendrick. He nodded. My grandfather came up with the solution over 100 years ago. But he and my father died before they could see it come to fruition. They just didn't have the ability to collect the chemicals, to identify them and separate them from the people without killing them. You see, Sarah Jane Smith, Mrs. Hendrick added, we didn't want to slaughter people to get the chemicals for our organic technology. We aren't savages. More likely you knew the murders would bring the authorities here, whereas missing memories could be hidden by the reputation of the place as a refuge for nutters who thought they'd been aboard spaceships, Rani said. You'd just become a joke, and no one would pay you much attention. Colin Hendrick crossed over to his wife and took her hand. We fell in love, and I agreed to carry on my family's work. When we finally get in touch with their spaceship, I will go with them. I sighed. Mr. Hendrick, Colin, I'm all for love and peace between species, but how do you know you can live in their atmosphere? Just because they've adapted to ours, there's no guarantee you can adapt to theirs. They may have any number of physical characteristics superior to ours to help them live on alien worlds. The human body is actually very frail and... I broke off, because the door had been opened and Roland Hendrick was slinking back in. Colin Hendrick frowned. I said we were not to be disturbed. He stopped as Ben Hendrick and a whole group of aliens marched in, with Luke and Clyde. I started to move towards Luke, but Mrs. Hendrick yanked me back. What is going on? She demanded. One of the aliens pointed at Luke. This child claims he can contact the mothership and get us home. Mrs. Hendrick shrugged. Oh, it will be a trap. You could have gone home years ago, Luke said. You chose not to. I wasn't sure what he meant, but the aliens were all looking at Mrs. Hendrick, as were Roland and Colin Hendrick. What is he talking about? Asked Ben. Mrs. Hendrick laughed. A fancy, she said. Childish imagination. You know what these humans are like. Ben stepped forward. We accessed his memories. I gasped. They had hurt Luke, but he looked fine. He has no memories prior to the past few years, Ben continued, because he is not a normal human child. He is a synthesized amalgam of human DNA. He is a perfect human, and his mind is brilliant. He is actually only a few years old, and our technology couldn't take his memories, only read them. There have been countless ways we could have left Earth. Peaceful races such as the Arcatinians, the Verons, even the Uvodni have been here and could have taken us home, but you kept telling us we had to use the chemicals in the humans' brains. Luke took over, but the chemicals are only actually used for keeping your people in stasis, comatose. It doesn't really power your transmitters. They are broken and useless. Every 50 years your mothership comes looking for you, but you deliberately make sure they can't find you. Why is that? Mrs. Hendrick laughed. This human is talking nonsense. No, he's not, Clyde said, because he's a genius. And while you lot were trying to suck up his memory juice, he was reading your records, the information in your organic techie whatnot, and he found out the truth. Your ship, it wasn't just any ship that crashed, was it? Luke asked Mrs. Hendrick. It was a special kind of ship. And you don't want to be found. Rani clicked her fingers. Was it a prison ship? Is that it? I asked Mrs. Hendrick. Are you escaped convicts? No, she said. My son, you have been led astray by these humans. She reached towards Ben, but the other aliens gathered around her. What is going on? They demanded. Mrs. Hendrick just smiled. If you want to go home, you have to trust me. And if you don't, I'm quite happy to stay here with Colin. Forever. But it won't be forever, will it? I asked. Colin will age. All humans do. But do your people, Mrs. Hendrick? Will he grow old and grey and die like his father and grandfather did? I have been doing this for centuries, Sarah Jane Smith, she snapped. Watching my human husbands die, creating new offspring to help mine the humans' brains for the chemicals that keep the rest of my original family in stasis until our sentence has run its course. You mean... I looked at the dozen or so aliens in the room, including young Ben and Roland. These people were all born on Earth. All half-breeds. She smiled. They don't live much longer than a human. She looked at Colin. Your grandfather was responsible for most of these. I am your brother, though, Roland said, but Mrs. Hendrick shook her head. You were firstborn, that is all. Luke stepped forward. We can contact your mothership, he said to the assembled aliens. And none of you are guilty of any crimes on your homeworld, I added. You could go home. Guilty of a few here, though, Rani said. All those people's memories? She looked at me. Including yours, Sarah Jane. You've forgotten about that year of your life with your Aunt Lavinia. You've lost that thanks to these people. I sighed, because that was true. And it hurt. These people had robbed me of something precious, something wonderful. But anger, hurt and disappointment weren't going to bring those memories back. They were gone, and until I'd started this investigation, I'd never even missed them. But that was something to deal with later. Mrs. Hendrick looked around at the faces of her people, trying to read them. I guess she saw more in their expressionless faces than I could. But she suddenly became furious. No, don't listen to them. They're lying. Of course they can't contact the ship. We won't be able to if you keep talking, Clyde said, because it'll soon be out of range of Mr. Smith. Ben Hendrick looked at Clyde, then Luke, and finally me. I want to go home. You're partially human, Mrs. Hendrick spat angrily. You might not survive out there. But if I can, why can't they? Asked the suddenly very scared Colin Hendrick. Mrs. Hendrick was beaten, and she knew it. She turned to look me in the eye. None of this will bring your Aunt Lavinia back, she yelled at me. No, it won't, I said to her. Nor will it help the people of this village whose memories you've stolen. But they'll cope, because human beings are not quite as weak-minded as you believe. I took out my mobile, called Mr. Smith and told him to contact the mothership out in space. It was soon over. The ship came into orbit, and within the hour, a series of ambassadors had travelled from it to the caves beneath the White Wolf, removing the comatose convicts and all trace of the aliens' technology. You will pay for this, Sarah Jane Smith, Mrs. Hendrick said as she was led away in chains. Yeah, whatever, Rani said, while Clyde just made an L shape with his fingers and held it up to his forehead. I've never really understood what it means, but I still pointed out that gloating was unnecessary. The villagers still had to be told the truth, of course, so I asked Luke and Edison Clough to gather everyone at Clough's cottage. There, I tried to explain what was happening. As I finished, the crowd parted, gasping as one of the aliens walked towards me. Do you represent the human race? She asked me. Not exactly, I said. But in truth, it might be better if this incident was quietly wrapped up without Earth's authorities getting involved. I'm sure you'd agree that we don't want the Shadow Proclamation finding out about this transgression either. The alien leader nodded. Thank you, she said, and turned to the villagers. We apologize for everything that was done to the people of this planet. It is not much, but it is all I can offer. And it is appreciated, I said. The alien turned and left the cottage, slowly followed by most of the bemused villagers. What if they take the story to the papers? Luke asked. Edison Clough sighed. With the reputation Wolfenden has, they'd be dismissed as cranks again. He turned and pointed to a figure slumped in a dusty armchair. It was Colin Hendrick. He was a shattered man. Everything he had believed in, everything he had done had collapsed around him. There isn't a prison on earth I can imprison you in, I said to him, because your crimes are literally out of this world. He gets away with helping steal my memories and yours," exclaimed Clough. But I could only shrug. "What would you have me do, Edison?" "I'm only a few years old," Luke told the old man. "I remember almost nothing compared to you. Whatever memories they took from you, you still have others." He reached up and plucked the photo of Edison with Lavinia and me off the wall. "You still have time to make new memories." He handed the photo to Clough, then walked out of the cottage, leaving me with a rather understandably embittered old man. "Got a good head on him, that boy of yours," said Clough. "Alien, is he?" I smiled. "No, he's human, just a bit." He waved the explanations away. "Either way, I'll not be telling anyone about any of this, and someone with a few years and experience needs to help this village pull itself back together. This was my home once. It can be again." "I'm glad," I smiled at him. "Good luck." He passed the photo of Lavinia over to me. "Please, take this home with you. And I'm so sorry, Sarah Jane," he said. "What for?" I asked. "Because if I hadn't written you that letter, you'd never have known that you had lost any memories of your aunt. That was selfish of me." I patted his arm. "Oh, I'm glad you did, because now I have a new picture of her. So, I am very grateful." I walked out of the cottage, then took a deep breath and looked at the photo. My Aunt Lavinia, the woman who had brought me up, treated me as her daughter and showed me how to be independent, to tell right from wrong and good from bad. I owe her so very much. I looked across to my rented cottage where Rani and Clyde were phoning their respective homes and apologising for sloping off without telling Geeta, Haresh or Carla first. I saw Luke come out with a tray of tea and cola and that big bag of sweets, which now looked significantly emptier. Luke, who I adopted, who I was bringing up as my son, who was getting more and more independent with each day, who knew right from wrong, usually, and good from bad, mostly. I was so proud of him. And that made me smile, because I knew that if Luke could make me so proud, then I must have made Aunt Lavinia proud too. I scooped Luke up and gave him a huge hug. "Oh, what was that for?" he asked. "Because I love you," I said, pulling Clyde and Rani in tightly as well. "Because we're family, and I love you all." The Sarah Jane Adventures, The White Wolf, was written by Gary Russel and read by Elisabeth Sladen. It was produced for BBC Audiobooks by Neil Gardner.